All right, well, it's nice meeting you guys. Like Lex said, I'm Chris, and I have had the privilege of growing up around music my entire life. My family's been involved in the music industry for a long time. My dad had a record label and did a lot of songwriting throughout the years before he became a pastor. My uncle's been in the music industry his whole life, has won a Grammy, playing with different people. I've had the privilege of being able to produce some records for some people, which I really enjoy doing that, the kind of creative process behind producing. I've been able to mix a record or two as well on the kind of recording studio end of things. But then also I was a technical director in a church for 8 years, as well as being an elder on staff there. And so kind of really understand the church world really well, and spent a lot of time doing that. I also currently work for an integration company called House Right, which we go around all around the United States installing sound systems in churches, large, small, big Meyer sound line array rigs, all the way down to little point sources in small churches. And so we really enjoy serving churches in that way, and kind of helping all churches kind of get better in their production. And so I've enjoyed working with those guys over the last year and a half. So all that to say, I know a little bit. I don't know everything. This is such a wide, expansive topic, talking about sound, especially talking about sound in churches. And each church is different. We know that. And sound inside of each church is different. But what I want to do tonight is I want to look a little bit at kind of the character and the role of a sound engineer inside of a church first, before I dive into the technical stuff of EQs and mix and all those kind of things, because I really feel like above and beyond being able to EQ well, being able to tune a sound system, be able to do this and that, the most important thing is our role as sound engineers inside of the church, and how that serves the church and how that interacts with leadership so that the church can move forward. I'm really passionate about that. I think it's a really important thing that we got to get right first. So I'm just going to hit a few kind of topics. This may feel a little preachy, but I'm sorry. I was a pastor for 8 years. So, but I do really feel like these things are so important. And so as production staff, whether it's sound, lighting, video, we love Jesus first. We love production second. I've been in so many church environments where they get that backwards. They love production first, and Jesus is like, oh yeah, that's like, a second thought. But it sounds so simple, but man, it's something that I've seen a lot of production people really get wrong. And so, I don't trust that that's an issue with any of you guys, but it is worth saying that we love Jesus first. We love production second. And that's kind of like the arbiter that we measure everything against. It's like, that's what we look at. It's Jesus first. How does this serve the church? How does this serve the kingdom? How does this glorify the Lord inside of our production world? Another thing that is very important that I've also seen a lot of people get really wrong inside of the production world is we must always and forever remain teachable. Always and forever we have to remain teachable. There's always someone who's better. There's always a new way of doing something, and there's always ways that we can grow as sound engineers and as production staff. Just because the industry is always changing. There's always new products coming out. So there's new ways of understanding sound in general. But then there's always someone we can learn from. There's always someone who has done something a different way that we can kind of pull information from. We have to remain teachable, and you have to be open to new ideas. And I've seen a lot of guys who kind of get locked down in their mind. This is the way I do it. And you try to give feedback, and it's like, well, this is my way. And it's like, it's just not a very helpful mentality. And if we're not teachable, it says several things about us. It says we're not humble. It says we think we know it all. And then personally, I believe it says we're not a very good sound engineer. Just because, if you think you know it all, then you don't. And again, I don't trust that that's an issue with any of you guys, but I just think it's something worth saying, even for you guys watching later on. It's just, you have to remain teachable. It's a good Christian thing to do, but it's also just a good thing to do as a sound engineer. And you have to constantly be training yourself, which is, again, part of that being teachable thing. You have to constantly be growing. And it's that way with anything that you do, whether it's playing a guitar or painting or writing or whatever it may be. You have to constantly be growing and training yourself. And so for us as sound engineers, we have to be doing the same thing. If we just show up on a Sunday and we just plug things in, push a few buttons and leave, then that's the only time we dedicate to our craft, to sound engineering, to even thinking about sound or sound for a Sunday morning, then we're really kind of missing the point. We need to be spending some time throughout the week, thinking about, hey, we're doing this song on Sunday. Maybe I can mix it this way. Maybe I can pull the kick drum here and do those kind of thoughts, or at least thoughts that we should be thinking as we head towards a Sunday. But we're going to talk more about training ourselves in a little bit when we get to the practical stuff. Another big point I want to hit, so far we've hit Jesus first, production second, always remain teachable. Third point I want to hit here is we're here to serve and not be served. The reason I'm hitting all of these points is because these are points that I've really seen a lot of production guys get really, really wrong. And so it's just some good heart stuff that we need to kind of keep in our minds. Our preferences do matter, but they take second seat to the whole. And that means if a certain standard has been set, we must use our knowledge and skills to meet that standard, not to reinvent the standard to our desires. It's another struggle I've seen happen in a lot of different church contexts is that church will have a sound, and tonight I'll talk a little bit about the sound. And what I mean by the sound is every church, every venue, every band ever that has ever existed has a sound, whether they've been intentional about that sound or not. Jubilee, Kloof Street has a sound. When you come in here, it's going to sound a certain way pretty much across the board between Sundays. Now, my South is coming out in me. But, it's just part of the acoustics of the room, the sound system that you have. And there's things that we can do to become consistent, which we're going to talk about. But in general, there's a sound. Now, a lot of times what I encourage people to do is to try to establish a sound that is, hey, we want it to sound this way. And a lot of times that happens with the sound guys and with the elders and, feedback that you get. One element of establishing a sound would be, we don't want it to be above 94 dB. Above 94 is just too loud. Vocal peaks at 94. That's part of establishing a sound. Another part, some churches choose to have very little low end because the sound that they want is one that doesn't have a lot of low end, and that's their choice. But as sound engineers, our job is to come in and to serve that sound that has been established by the team, or if you're in charge of establishing the sound, then it's kind of your job to help new people realize, hey, this is kind of the goal that we're going for. And you have to have a goal. You have to have an end place to land with, if you're mixing, Stephen Slate, who's a really famous mix engineer, has mixed a lot of rock records. He's a rock mix engineer. He says that when he sits down to mix a record, he'll listen through the raw tracks first, and then he'll stop, and then he envisions, without ever pushing any buttons or twisting any knobs, he envisions what that final track is going to sound like. He plays it in his mind, and then after he has that end goal, only then does he sit down and start tweaking knobs and moving stuff around. And I think that's so important for us in the church world, is we have to have an end goal. We want it to sound like XYZ. 94 dB, good low end, want to hear the drums really well, balanced mix. That's kind of the standard things that we're going for, but you have to have an end goal. And so our job as sound men is to use our knowledge and our skills, not to reinvent that sound, but to serve that sound and to serve the church in that way. Another thing, this is kind of wrapping up this kind of the heart stuff, the personal stuff, before we get into some practical stuff. We are as much a vital member of the worship team as anyone who is on that stage. Another thing, again, that I've seen happen so many times in churches is that there's a massive dividing wall straight down the middle of the auditorium, dividing worship team and production team. And it's a really unhealthy thing because a lot of times there's contention between the two. There's, the worship leader doesn't like the sound guy. He never gives me reverb in my monitor. And the sound guy's like, oh, that guitar player never does what I want, never turns his amp down or whatever it may be. And there's a lot of kind of bickering back and forth between a lot of sound teams and production teams and worship teams. And until we all realize that we all are a part of the worship team, then that's going to continue to happen, and there's going to continue to be this discontent between the two. But for us as sound engineers, and this is more personally something that I truly believe, and so you can take it as you may. But I honestly believe that as we're like running the sound desk, that's our instrument. The iPad back here, you're actually operating an instrument that is involved in this process of leading people in worship. And the choices you make on that sound desk are as important as the notes that the guitar player plays or the words that the worship leader sings, because you are leading people in worship. And the sound that you're crafting and creating you're taking all these pieces, and it's actually more of an orchestration kind of thing than it is just pushing buttons. But you're taking all these pieces and you're putting them together into one cohesive sound that is leading people in worship. And so it's really important for us to not see ourselves separated from the worship team, but to see ourselves as part of the worship team, using our soundboard as an instrument to worship the Lord. And when we start viewing it that way, then one, it's easier to start to see that as a craft. Hey, what's up? Yeah, grab some chairs, guys. We'll let you guys get settled and we'll keep going. So yeah, when we start to view ourselves as part of the worship team and as part of helping lead people in worship, then it totally changes how we view the worship team, how we view the people, and how we view what we do. And to that point, the guitar player playing on the worship team practices his guitar. We should also be practicing our instrument. We should be getting better and learning new things about running sound, about the particular console that we're running. In this case, an X32 with an iPad. We need to learn those things and know those things so that we can troubleshoot and so that we can be good at what we do. Another key ingredient to that and being a vital part of the worship that happens inside of the church is that we have to be present when we're using our instrument. So if a guitar player is playing and he's just not present, he just kind of checks out. It's like, oh, well, that ceiling's really tall, and like just stops paying attention. He's going to play wrong notes. It's going to sound horrible. It's the whole worship time is people are going to be distracted and their eyes are going to be taken off of the Lord just because he's not paying attention. For us as sound guys, I've seen so many guys. They come in, they turn it on, push a few buttons, get their level set during rehearsal, and they totally check out. They pull out their phone. They're on Instagram. They're just like letting the whole service go by. They're not paying attention. And as sound engineers and as Christians, as believers, we need to be engaged. We need to be present. And we need to even look for moments inside of doing what we do to worship the Lord and to turn the affection of our hearts towards Him in a moment of worship, knowing that we're a vital part to that moment that's happening. So set it and forget it doesn't work. It doesn't cut it to just set your levels in rehearsal and just forget it. You need to be attentive. You need to be, live mixing to a point. Don't. And when I say live mix, I mean, pulling faders down in between, sections of the song, or maybe adjusting EQs, between songs. You don't need to overdo that. You don't need to just be changing everything, but it's more of just being present. It's like, oh man, that they need to come down just a little bit during this section, or come up during this section. It's all part of being present. It's all part of being engaged with what's happening in the room. We have to listen and adapt to stay consistent. And we'll talk more about consistency here in a little bit. And so the last little bit of this kind of personal kind of heart section that I want to hit is Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. And this is a verse that on its own, outside of this context, it's a good verse. But when we start applying it to sound and production, man, a lot of the things spoken about in this verse it's a struggle for a lot of production guys to really execute what is charged here. So Colossians 3:12, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And so many times in the production world, it's hard to keep those things on. It's hard to stay clothed in gentleness when you're so frustrated at the band and the guitar player that you've told to turn his guitar down, 1,000 times. Or, it's hard to keep that kindness and compassion thing going. And, then after a while of doing it, sometimes it can be difficult to keep the humility thing in check because we feel like we have it all figured out. But I just want to charge you guys with that. I'll read it again. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. So those are kind of the kind of heart things that I wanted to get at. And for those of you guys that just stepped in, I'm just going to kind of read through those 4 main points. Is that we love Jesus first, we love production second. We must always and forever be teachable. We're here to serve, not to be served. And we are as much a vital member of the worship team as the worship team who's on the stage. All right, so that kind of closes out the kind of personal kind of character and role of a sound engineer. But I want to talk a little bit about the practicality, some practicals to being a sound engineer. And hopefully, no matter where you're at along the spectrum, whether you've been doing this a really long time or whether you've never done it, hopefully some pieces of this will be something that you can pick up and something that you can kind of log and be like, yeah, that's helpful. The first thing is that you have to train your ears to listen, which is a funny thing to say. Our ears are naturally made to listen. But as a sound engineer, it's so important that we actually spend time and dedicate time to training our ears and learning how to listen, and specifically learning how to listen to music. We all listen to music, and I'm sure we all have a favorite band and favorite song or whatever it may be. But we have to start learning how to pick apart music, how to hear different elements. I remember my dad, when I was just a little boy, we would ride down the road and he would play songs and he'd be like, do you hear the, whatever it may be, do you hear the shaker in the background? And at first I'd be like, no, I don't hear it. And then I would listen, I would stop and I'd be really intentional. And then way back there in the background, the mix engineer put this in, and that one shaker piece actually made the song, come alive, but you never noticed it. And it's all a part of learning how to listen. So as sound engineers, we have to learn how to listen. We have to learn what general frequency each instrument kind of lives in. And I've got a sheet that I'm going to pass out here in a second that we can kind of look at that kind of visualizes, I'm a visual person, visualizes kind of the frequencies and where each instrument should sit in the mix. But if you've never run sound, you may, Yeah, at first, it seems like an insult to say that someone wouldn't know the frequencies that a kick drum would, kind of occupy. But you would be surprised. There's some people out there. It's like you show them a kick drum, and they're like, what frequencies would that occupy? They would have no idea that it's low frequencies. They're like, I don't know, what's a frequency? And so then you kind of have to start, back at square one. But as sound engineers, I'm working off of a trust that you guys have a base knowledge of, at least a little bit of, a kick drum would be like a low frequency, a cymbal would be a high frequency, and some of those things. You don't have to know it all. We're gonna look through the sheet here in a little bit, but frequency-wise, I will explain that for a second. Everything that we hear is on a scale, a hertz scale, a frequency scale from 0 to 20,000, and most people can't hear above 16,000 hertz. That's really super high frequencies. Like a dog whistle is, I think, 20,000 hertz or something like that. Me personally, I actually can't hear anything above 11,000 hertz, which is why I'm not mixing projects much anymore, because I just can't hear. And those frequencies make, in the grand scheme of things, make very little difference in the final mix. But for me, I just can't hear anything above 11K. And that's just damage and not taking care of my ears over the years. But that's really high frequencies, and your vocals are going to live in between 1 and 2,000 hertz, and you'll hear that referenced as 1K or 2K. And then getting lower and coming down the spectrum, you'll get into like bass guitar is going to live between anywhere from 30 hertz, which is really, really low and right on the threshold of human hearing, all the way up, and it can actually cover, depending on how you EQ it, all the way up to 10,000 hertz. But, most of the time it's living in those low, 80 to 400 hertz range. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about frequencies, hertz. I say 1K, 2K, it's talking about that frequency spectrum. You don't have to fully understand it. You don't even have to understand it on a basic level, but I just want to let you know that that's what I'm talking about when I talk about those frequencies. So as sound engineers, if you don't know kind of a basic knowledge about frequencies and how they, where instruments sit and those kind of things, that is something you do need to know. You need to develop a knowledge of that. Because mixing is all about creating space. When you mix a band on a Sunday morning, what you're doing is you're carving out different frequencies out of those instruments, and you're putting them all together in one thing that sounds like one whole. If every instrument is covering every element of the frequency band from bottom to top, and they're all you just end up getting this noise, this mud that just sounds horrible. You have to carve, but you also have to know where to carve. And so I trust that, if you guys have, worked on this board or X32 or any sound console in general, you've at least had a basic knowledge of the frequency band. And so something that I will say about training yourself, there is so much free information on the internet. And so if you don't know, there's no reason that you can't find what you need to know. The University of YouTube is everything. You can find anything and everything you need to know. Just Google, frequency band, or how to EQ a kick drum, or whatever it may be. You will find it on YouTube. Another place that I want to kind of point you guys to, and I'll reference this again at the end, is a website called Pensado's Place. PENSADOS place.com. Dave Pensado, world famous mix engineer, but his website, he has a ridiculous amount of free content that you can watch to learn, and all of his stuff is based in the studio, but the application of it applies in a live setting fairly generally. He'll talk about compression, how compression works, and EQ, and how to EQ a vocal. And yes, there are differences in how you would EQ a vocal in a studio setting, but those differences aren't large enough for you to not get anything out of that and be able to apply it in a live setting. So yes, go out, learn, YouTube it. If you don't know, figure it out. And that sounds like a really kind of, harsh kind of way of saying it, but that's how I learned a lot of stuff early on. And that's how a lot of really great mix engineers have learned a lot of stuff over the years. They've been proactive and they've just figured it out. And we'll talk more about that as we go down. Again, learn how to identify frequencies and kind of where instruments set within those frequencies. And something that I would challenge all of you guys to do is to start to train your ear so much so that you can actually recognize fairly accurately different frequencies. And so there's tone generators that you can get, free app on your phone, and it'll generate tones from 0 all the way up to 20,000 hertz. And so if you play 1K, and it's like, woo, somewhere in that range will be your 1K hertz or 1K frequency, and you can actually learn that's what that sounds like. And you can learn what 320 sounds like. You can learn what 8K sounds like. And that sounds like a really finite thing to be doing. But as sound engineers, you'll actually find that the more you do that and the more you just train your ear to kind of recognize at least just a general area of where that frequency is at, it'll help you mix on a Sunday morning when a frequency is just really kind of jumping out as a really nasty frequency. You'll be able to find it a little bit quicker. And there's some techniques for finding frequencies that I'll talk about in a little bit, because we're going to dive deep on some of this stuff. Some of this stuff's going to be over your head. That's fine. We'll have it recorded. You can go back and watch this again. So as you're learning frequencies, learning the frequency band, the whole point is so that we can identify and remove harsh frequencies. Everything has harsh frequencies in some places. And our goal is to take those harsh frequencies out so that when everything is mixed together, it sounds good. We want it to sound good. That's the goal. And so one way of identifying harsh frequencies, you don't have to listen and be able to say, that's 1.2K, I need to pull that out. There's plenty of guys out there that can do that. But if you're listening and you're like, man, that's a mid-range frequency, I'm hearing something in the mid-range that sounds really kind of out of place, then you can get on the soundboard, and actually a really simple technique is to take that frequency, or take a frequency in the mid-range, whatever you want to grab, and just boost it. And then slide it back and forth. And when you hear it get really, really nasty, that's the frequency you need to pull out. Just pull it down. It's really simple. It's like find the bad one and pull it out. But those small little adjustments will make such a huge difference in the long run with getting good, consistent mixes. A mix at 94 dB with harshness can sound louder than a smooth and clean mix at 100 dB. I've seen it happen time and time again. That if you don't have, or if you have really harsh frequencies in the vocals, man, those vocal peaks can slice your head off. And yet the mix is still only at 94 or 95, but man, it hurts. Pun intended. Sorry, I couldn't resist that one. But anyway, the goal is getting smooth, clean mixes. And yes, compression plays into this and gates play into this. And I'm not going to talk a lot, if any, about compression and gates tonight. But the goal is to not have harshness in the mix. So to that point, I do want to pull up one thing. Okay, so this is what's called RTA. But essentially it just is a bar graph of frequencies. And so again, you can kind of see what I was talking about there. The scale on the bottom from 0, this shows up to kind of 18K once you get there past 16. And then on the right-hand side, the 50 through 100, that's decibels, which is the loudness of frequencies. So this is actually the middle of the loudest song in here this past Sunday. And so, and I don't know who was running this past week. I'm not like trying to like point it out. I actually have screenshots from the week before as well, and they're really consistent with this one as well. But I wanted to take a minute and just kind of point this out. So the dB meter there at the top is registering max dB that morning at 93.2, which is a good level. That's a good place to aim for. But one thing that I want to point out is if you look at that 93.2 was actually registered by a frequency somewhere along 800 hertz. And then it looks like 1.5K wasn't far behind that frequency. So what does that mean? That means that overall our mix was actually somewhere around 80, 85. But if we used a dB meter, would think that we're running a mix at 93, but it was those vocal peaks that were really kind of jumping out at us. And so that was fairly consistent. And so what we want to do as sound engineers, and this is an app that you can buy. I think there's some free RTAs out there. I've actually A/B'd this app alongside a $600. Okay, yeah. All right, so that's if you have it on the iPad, then you can reference that. But it's a really good thing just to kind of like put your eyes on. We want to mix with our ears, but it's a good thing to put your eyes on what's happening frequency-wise in the room. Now, one thing I will say is the iPad one, is it pulling off of the signals that are coming into the board? Okay. So one thing I would say, it's good to have an external one that's actually pulling off of what the speakers are reproducing in the room, because these speakers are going to take that and reproduce it in a different way, and the acoustics in here are going to change all of that. But on the whole, what we want to do is mix in a way that it's actually fairly level, that all of those levels are across the board. So we have like a large 125 dip. I would imagine that's happening in the EQ in this room because of the concrete and everything. I would imagine those frequencies are pulled out because they could get really nasty. But on the whole, we want to mix in a way that, we see we have a lot of high-end roll-off. That easily could be that these speakers can't produce those high-end frequencies really well. It could be a couple different things, but the main thing I wanted to point out from this RTA image was just the fact that a lot of our volume was coming from those mid-range frequencies, which a lot of times that's where your harshness will live. That's where if somebody says, "Oh man, it's loud," they're gonna say that 90% of the time because of a mid-range frequency. So as you're learning the frequency scale, as you're learning where different things sit, you'll learn how to pull harshness out of things. Now you have to be careful when you're EQing harshness out of things, because you actually totally take the life out of something. You could have real bad harshness in a vocal between 800 and 2K, but if you suck all of that 800 2K out of your vocal, you won't have a vocal left. So you just have to be careful and kind of like nuance it a little bit. So I don't want to get in the weeds too much, but I just wanted to reference that for a second. And I have, I'm going to go ahead and pass these around. Take one and I'll pass it to you, brother. So our goal is we want the sound to feel full, but not overwhelming. We want it to be loud enough to where people feel engaged so that they can sing. If it's too quiet, then people won't feel the freedom to really sing out, and we want them to sing out. So we want it to feel full. We want it to have some volume to it, but we don't want it to be overwhelming, because what happens when it gets too loud, what happens when we get a lot of harsh frequencies is people then disengage just because it hurts to listen to. So what we have here in front of us, this is, I actually drew this up today because I couldn't find one that I wanted. I had one from years ago, but this is kind of like my way of mixing. Now this is going to seem really, really confusing, but I'm going to take a second to explain it. So again, on the left-hand side, you have your frequency ranges. On the bottom, you have your pan from left to right. So is this room set up mono or is it stereo? Stereo. Sweet. There's some churches that are still in mono, and I'm like, what are you doing? It's okay. We love them too. But yeah, so glad you guys are in stereo. So
Can I say something?
You can.
We have stereo output for the entire drum kit, one output.
For you, just okay.
Stereo is drum kit left,
okay.
right. So you get everything. You get your snare, your hi-hats, your cymbals, everything.
All right.
On one output.
Okay. I'll speak to that. I'll speak to that in a second.
That's a little bit of a challenge there.
Yeah, yeah, that would be a challenge. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. So, mixing in general, what you'll see here. So I tried to put the name of each circle kind of in a place where you could see that's specifically what it is. So I don't need to put this up there. We're all looking at it. But the first thing that you'll notice is that the majority of what you're trying to mix lands where? Lands center and in those mid-range frequencies. You got snare drum, you got vocals happening there, you've got synths, you've got some drum stuff in there, you've got keys and acoustic, and so your challenge is to EQ all of those things in a way where they live together in a way that's not harsh. And so this chart is really just for reference. I'm not going to fully explain it right now, but it's something that you can look back at. And use it as a visual reference for when you're mixing, kind of like putting things into a place, putting things into a space. And so, and also this is obviously not perfect, because you'll see, well, I've got bass down at the bottom, but me personally, I like to put a little bass sizzle in at like 8K. So I couldn't like make bass cover up the whole thing. Snare drum also, I love like a good crack in the snare drum at like 8K and like a nice little bump at 200 hertz. So those like small little things, I can't put in this graph, but overall, this is a good starting point for how to visualize your mix. And you should be visualizing your mix and think in your mind, okay, if I was to take my mix that I'm hearing right now, close my eyes, listen to my mix. What am I hearing and what does that look like? Is it one really, really, really big dark round circle from 120 to 10K that's all acoustic guitar? And I don't hear my kick drum at all. Where's the electric guitar player? There's electric. And like electric guitar player comes up, but he's really, really harsh and like really, really bad tones. What can I do to fix that? We'll talk about that in a second. All those things, you should be visualizing those things as you mix. So this is just a visual guide. It may be helpful, it may not, but it's kind of how I visualize mixing. I want to take a second and look at the other 3 pages. These other 3 pages are not mine, but they're things that are maybe helpful. So the second page is a similar thing, but just kind of a different way of visualizing frequencies and where instruments live in the different frequency bands. So again, I'm not going to talk through this one, but I do encourage you to sit down with this and just study over it. See if any of it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, Google it. And it's like, why does that not make sense? I don't know what this means. Just look it up and train yourself. Turn to the next page. A lot of people like to really downplay or they dismiss cheat sheets for EQing, but the bottom line is that it's helpful. If you've never EQ'd anything ever in your life, this is a good cheat sheet of like where to start. This is not at all set it and forget it. This is how it should be forever. This is just like where to start, with your kick drum. Most kick drums really, really love 63 hertz. If you boost 63 hertz on most kick drums, it's gonna sound really, really amazing. And so learning that may take years to learn, but between 50 and 70 hertz, find somewhere in there where the kick drum sounds good. And I personally, I never boost any EQs. When I'm EQing something, I don't boost, I only cut. So this says EQ boost. This was also done for studio guys. The premise is still very close for live sound. You can at least start at what this says and go from there. But so for a kick drum, even though I never boost, I probably would boost a little bit around 63. So again, it's just kind of like learning all of these frequencies. And as sound guys in a church, you should be learning this stuff. It's not enough just to come in and just turn it on and hope that you can like ride it out with no feedback until you get to the end of the service. You've got to train yourself. You've got to learn this stuff, even if it's just a basic knowledge. And that's why I've given you guys these cheat sheets. Last page, it's a very similar thing, just by a different person. And this actually explains, and the other one went by instrument, this goes by frequencies. So just, it says 60 to 200, add for tom boom, cut to decrease bass boom, 80 hertz, boost for the kick drum, lower end, cut through the mix, just kind of some good starting points. So if you've never mixed, or if you have no idea what you're actually doing when it comes to mixing, these are just some good starting points you can reference back to that'll help you kind of go in the right direction. Everybody tracking? Everybody doing good? All right, let's put our packets away. You can look at them later. All right, 2 more practical things for training your ears to listen. Go to shows where the sound's really good. If you expect that, like say, some artist that you really enjoy is coming into town, invest in yourself, buy a ticket to that concert, and you can probably assume that the sound is going to be good. Go to that show and then listen to how they've mixed it. Enjoy the artist, but listen, how is this mixed? Where do they have things placed? The same way that you visualize your mix and that you visualize what you're doing in this room or in OBS on a Sunday morning, visualize that guy's mix. And then another thing I would encourage you to do is go be nosy. Walk up to the sound desk and ask questions. Don't be annoying, because a lot of times these guys are like, they got a lot of stuff going on. But if you see a moment where they have a break, ask some questions. Be like, hey, how do you blah, 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 blah. Whatever you have on your mind. But these guys do it for a living. And so it's always great to ask questions. One of my closest friends, he's actually my best friend, been my best friend for years and years and years. He is the head sound tech at New Spring Church in America. And whether you like New Spring or not, they've had some issues over the years. They're still the 5th largest church in America, and he's worked that job for 9 years now. And he had to work his way up, but he now oversees sound centrally. And for their main campus, and then also for all their satellite campuses. And he got that job because he was being nosy at a sound desk. We were at a service, we just went to the service, and he starts talking to the guy running sound. Turns out the guy running sound was the head of all the sound stuff, and through that interaction, he actually got that job. And so you never know what'll happen when you go talk to the guys at the desk. So I would encourage you to do that. And again, Pensado's place, another place to get good content from. I think you have to pay for it though, which is a bummer. Is Mix with the Masters is a good one. And I'm telling you, YouTube, like you'll find whatever you need to find on YouTube, which is amazing. But again, be training yourself, be training your ears, learn your frequencies, learn where things sit. Learn what makes an electric guitar sound good. Learn what makes an electric guitar sound bad. and just log all those things in your memory. They'll all become second nature when you start to mix, and you'll get better and better and better, and you'll be a better engineer by the end of it. All right, a few more things as we're kind of headed towards the end here. So another thing is you have to learn your equipment to be proficient at what you're doing here at the church. So this may be a strong statement. I wouldn't advise doing this, but every one of you should be able to totally tear down this entire sound system and put it all back together and know what each piece of it does. You should be able to know where each cable should go. You should know everything that's happening in the rack back here. You should know all of your cable paths. Like, do you know how your signals get into your mains? You should know that in this building as a sound engineer. Every sound engineer should know that. And it should be part of the training process as guys are coming in, as you guys are training new guys that are coming along. They should learn that. The reason that should be the case is because when something goes wrong, you need to know how to troubleshoot. You need to know the little kind of nuances of your system so that when something goes wrong, you can fix it. So a really close friend of mine, he was actually here last week for the conference, but he's now a full-time elder at our church in North Carolina. But before that, he was a professional sailor for 8 years, and he has one boat he sailed for nearly 10 years now. But it's a Pearson 30, and it's not an amazing boat. It's not this super fancy boat, but it's his boat. And he has said so many times that every single creak, every single noise on that boat, he knows exactly what that is. Every little tick, when it's under sail or when the motor's on, he knows every little detail. And if something doesn't sound right, he knows exactly where to go to fix it. That's how we should be with our system that we're running. One, it'll help us troubleshoot, but two, it'll also help us improve our sound overall, is because we'll know the weak links. We'll know, what we can do to kind of improve as we move forward. And each of you guys, when it comes to learning your equipment, you should also either have or develop basic integration skills. What I mean by integration is like installing sound systems and doing all those kind of things. But those basic skills would be soldering. If you don't know how to solder, learn to solder, get a soldering iron. Maybe the church could get just like a cheap little soldering iron to keep here. If a cable goes bad, instead of just throwing it out and getting a new one, just fix the cable. One, it's much more efficient. It's definitely more, it's better cost-wise. But then also it's just, if a cable goes bad on Sunday morning and you're really good at soldering, that cable could be back up and being used within like 2 minutes if you really know what you're doing. And so just those kind of basic skills, just like, pull that XLR apart, that needs to be soldered back, get your soldering iron, heat it up, solder it, put it back on, and you can be rolling again. Instead of that kind of derailing and trying to find another cable. Well, it's in that box over there, and then it's like, by the time you find another cable, it's been 15 minutes. Whereas if you have those skills, you can fix stuff pretty quick. And then, some more advanced skills are always handy, just kind of like termination of more things than XLRs and quarter inch. If learn how to terminate RJ45 and, do Ethernet and stuff, those kind of things will really pay off in the long run. Let's see. So this is another key ingredient to equipment. This plays into consistency as well, which is going to be our last thing we talk about. But you need to learn your musician's equipment. If you have one guitar player that plays in here on a regular basis and plays this amp and this pedal board, don't take his stuff from him and be obtrusive, but at least learn what he's got. If he's running a pedal board, learn what's on his board, because ultimately your goal as the sound engineer is to make everything out here sound good. Now, this can be a difficulty. What I'm about to talk about can be a difficulty if you haven't built this culture, but I would highly advise to build this culture. But what needs to happen, what is the best way forward in I will say all churches, is the guy running sound needs to be in charge of how the final sound comes out. And I'm saying this as an electric guitar player, but if the electric guitar player is playing and his amp is really, really harsh, let's just say, just for an extreme example, he loves metal. Electric guitar player plays metal all the time. So he's gonna set the amp with tons of gain, tons of distortion, no reverb, and sound really, really kind of like harsh and like nasty. Well, because we've established a sound, because we've established a direction that we're going as a whole, that's not it. We're not gonna have metal electric guitar. So as the sound engineer should be able to go to the electric guitar player and say, hey man, can I work on your amp a little bit? Can we pull the gain back? And just so that we can get this mixed in well. But if you build a culture for that kind of interaction, then the electric guitar player should say, yeah man, whatever you need to do to make it sound good in the house. And a lot of electric guitar players and musicians in general are they wouldn't admit it, but there's some pride there. It's like, this is my sound. I like it this way. And that's a hard thing to walk around. And I would advise that being a long process of establishing that culture, elders involved, the whole 9 yards, because it's a people thing. But once you've built that culture, then the sound guy can say, hey man, can we dial the gain back on your amp? Yeah man, go ahead, whatever you need. Dial it back, get his ears set, but then at that point you can mix it in a way that actually sounds good in the house. Because there's sometimes, if a musician's giving you X, Y, Z, sometimes that's just not usable. Have any of you guys ever done the whole I'm just going to turn that all the way down. All right, that sounds great. It's like, that's not what we want. We actually want them to be there. We want them to be involved. And I think it actually honors them and serves them better to get them to a point where you can actually have them in a mix. And so that's kind of like a worship team, production team kind of thing. But once you do that, it will really, really help. And you guys don't have acoustic drums in here, but I know you guys do in OBS. And if you guys get acoustic drums in here at some point, another thing that I would highly advise is that the sound guy tunes the drums. Some drummers are like, oh, no. Again, something you have to build into your culture. But the sound guy knows what needs to happen in the house for those drums to sit well in the mix. And so if the drummer is constantly tuning the toms in a way that they've just got this ridiculous ring and it's not usable, but that's what they like, you need to be able to have the flexibility and the freedom to say, hey, can we retune these toms so that they can sit well in the mix? So again, those are like long haul, building culture things that you should strive for. But again, it will help get better sound in the house and a more consistent sound. So that does segue us into consistent sound. Consistency is the biggest struggle with churches because we have different sound engineers, we have different worship leaders, different musicians every week. Every week, everything's changing. A touring band, I have quite a few friends who tour on a regular basis. A friend of mine is a guitar player for John Mark McMillan. He's been playing for John Mark McMillan for 5 years now. And they have been tweaking his mix on the same console for 5 years now. So his in-ears mix, he's like, it's pure gold. It's perfect. It's because they've been tweaking it to the point of perfection for years. And so those guys, consistency is not so much an issue because it's the same every show. Boom, 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 knock it out. I saw Coldplay in New York last year. And it was I think they said they were on their 98th show of that tour, something ridiculous. But you could tell they had it dialed. Every element of that show was dialed. And so consistency is not an issue for those guys. But in churches, everything's changing all the time. And as soon as you think you are getting something consistent, then something else changes. And it's how do you manage all of that? So there's a few things that we can do to kind of mitigate that struggle and kind of get to a point of consistency inside of a church context. So I'm going to talk about big struggles, 2 big struggles. Big struggle number 1 is musician preference. And so a lot of times it's a struggle, and that's what I was just talking about a second ago. But really working with musicians to get their preferences to a point to where it works with what you're doing in the house, and whenever you start viewing yourself, like I was talking about earlier, as part of the worship team, and we really start to, tearing down this wall between the production team and the worship team, and everybody starts seeing themselves on the same team, then it becomes more like going to a brother and saying, hey man, like there's this mutual love, there's this mutual like appreciation, there's this mutual honor for each other because you're on the same team, you're on the same page. It's not like production team versus worship team, it's like we're all worship team. Then once that happens, it actually, you can go to your brother and be like, hey man, can we just like adjust this a little bit? And because there's actual honor and appreciation for each other, then you can do it. Instead of there being this kind of like, oh, that sound guy's always telling me to turn my amp down or whatever, And so I would say, again, fight to have that kind of relationship with your worship team, because then you can influence their preferences for the greater good of the sound in the church. Big struggle number 2 is sound engineer preference. And again, we have different sound engineers every week, and a lot of times we mix to our own preferences. But as you guys move forward, and you guys try to figure out what is, if we could paint a picture in this room of what would perfect sound for Jubilee Kloof Street be with what we're working with right now, because I'm going to talk about equipment and this room in particular in a second, and some things to look out for in this room with the current setup. But with current setup, with what we have, what we're working with, what would a really, really good mix sound like? That should be our goal for consistency every week. And every sound guy should come in and mix to that goal, not to personal preference. Every sound guy should mix to this kind of standard. And so because I'm not here on a regular basis, because I've only been here 2 Sundays in a row, I personally can't fully speak to what that is. I think it would be good for you guys as a sound team to get together and talk through, hey, what's this goal? I think elders need to be involved. Lex, you really know what sounds good in music. And so maybe Lex could influence like, hey, this sounds good. Or another thing would be is like, if there's a Sunday where, man, sound was really, really on point that Sunday, log that as a good reference point to aim for. That's kind of like what you need to visually kind of aim for as you're mixing each week. But again, a big struggle number 2 for consistency is sound engineer preference. 8 times out of 10, our preferences as sound engineers will match what the church is going for. We like, a good sounding kick drum. We like, guitars and this kind of thing. 80% of the time, our preferences are going to match the church. It's not like we're trying to do something totally off the wall. But it's really that 20% of the time that affects consistency. And what would that look like? Well, that could look like 1 week, your peak dB is 89, and your next week, your peak dB is 101. I've seen that happen. And it's like 1 week, it's like, man, I can't hear anything. Next week, it's like, it's like head just getting sliced off. Establishing, we want it to be 94 dB. Or one sound engineer prefers classical music, so he mixes the drums way, way low. Another sound engineer is a rocker who can't hear, and so he mixes the drums like way, way too loud. Well, we need to have an open, teachable culture inside of our production team to where we can all get to a point to where we agree, hey, and if you get feedback, responding to that feedback, okay, I realize that I missed the mark in aiming for the sound that we are looking to have here at Jubilee Kloof Street. And so I want to talk about feedback for a second. Allow for feedback. It's part of being teachable. It's part of being a teachable person is allowing feedback. And I would say allow for feedback from everyone but don't change everything. So a lot of times as sound guys, we'll get feedback from the people in the congregation. I would say if you get feedback from the people in the congregation, don't change your mix. Take that feedback to an elder, and you and the elder talk through whether or not the mix needs to be changed. Because if we change our mix to appease everyone, our mix will get massively more inconsistent. So as you get feedback, take that feedback to an elder. But I will say, if you get feedback from an elder, then that's when your mix changes. And I will also say, and I'm saying this because I've seen this happen before, and I don't know if this happens in this context, but if it does, I want to speak to it. If it doesn't, you guys are awesome. But if you get feedback from an elder in the moment about your mix, change it. Just make the change. And if you have an issue with that, and if you feel like that feedback doesn't line up with the end goal that you've set as Jubilee sound, then have a conversation with the elder afterward and say, hey, I really didn't feel like that set. And you guys can work through that afterward. But in the moment, if an elder asks for a change it. And then remind yourself that the goal of the mix is not what I want, but what serves the church best, because we're here to serve and we're here to be a part. And I would venture to say, if an elder does come with an adjustment, that it's not one that is meant to like downplay your ability as a sound engineer. It's meant to serve the greater good of the church who's in the room in the moment. So I just want to speak to that for a second, because I've seen that go really, really bad before. An elder comes and like asks for an adjustment, and a sound engineer like all but gets up and walks out of the church. Like, this is my mix. And it's like, no, it's not your mix. This is our mix, because we're all going for this. And so that's big struggle number 2. So again, musician preference and sound engineer preference. So when you're aiming for consistency, I want to talk about this room for a moment. How many of you guys mix in this room on a regular basis? A couple of you guys. So this room in particular, hard room to mix in. You've got concrete floors, you've got wooden ceilings, you know, it actually does help you a little bit with the angle of the walls, but man, there is a lot of stuff going on in this room sound-wise. And so a couple things to keep in mind as you're aiming for a consistent mix. I've actually thought for the past 2 Sundays that the low end sounded good in this room. And I think at different times the kick sounded like it should. And so I don't think low end's a big issue in here. I've got some suggestions that I'm going to pass along to Lex as far as your mains and sound treatment. I think one of the biggest things that can help and will help eventually in this room is sound treatment. And there's some real simple sound treatment that can be done that will really help you guys mix and get a better mix going in this room. But even mains wise, maybe some adjustments that we can make with mains. There's actually a big phase dropout between the mains, because they're both turned in just a little bit. There's a big phase drop that happens like right here in the middle that I was noticing. And so phase, for those of you guys that don't know, is when sound waves phase can get really complicated. But for the sake of the moment, say 2 sound waves are traveling together. As long as they're going like this, everything sounds good. When they start doing that, everything sounds really bad. And that's kind of some phase issues that I was noticing in here. But yeah, I think even, just thinking about like this room as a whole, being careful with effects and being careful with vocals. I think those vocal peaks, those kind of like mid-range, 1K, 2K kind of frequencies, those frequencies will hit all of these surfaces, and man, they'll just roll around the room. I noticed a couple times on Sunday, Cioli would really dig in, and it was like, oh, there she is, hey, and it's like, part of that is because it's just being amplified by all these reflective surfaces. So consistency-wise, I think the main thing to keep in mind is helping your musicians stay consistent with the sound that they are giving you. and keep going. And that's part of that musician preference thing. Help them. Somebody help them. Be consistent with the sound that they're giving you. And if they give you something on a Sunday that sounds not like what they normally do, come to them. In kindness, be like, hey, that doesn't sound quite like what your guitar normally sounds like. Can we work on that for a second? And just kind of work through it. And then again, also just keep your preferences in mind. And another thing is, I would hope that you all come to church when you're not running sound. Some places they don't. If you're not on, then those guys don't go to church. And I would say, come to church, obviously, whenever you're not scheduled, and worship and engage, and also notice your buddy's mix. And it should be a culture of not cutting each other down and not undermining each other because we think we know it all, but helping each other grow together as a team, because none of us have it figured out. It goes back to that being teachable thing. We don't know it all, but if we can all help each other grow and help each other's mix get better and better and better and help each other towards consistency, that'll be a really healthy thing for the production team, healthy thing for the church as a whole. So in closing, and then we'll do some kind of questions and just kind of like talk through some stuff. Your personal goal should be to glorify God by using your gifts and talents to serve His body. If you ever feel like your heart and or actions don't align with that goal, whether in the moment or on a consistent basis, then pause and ask the Lord to reveal what it is that has changed. Is it pride? Is it frustration? Is it exhaustion, etc.? Take those things to the Lord. Talk to somebody about those, whether a brother or a sister or an elder, and ask the Lord to renew your zeal to serve and your heart for worship, and worshiping through your craft as a sound engineer. Because I think that, again, kind of circling back to what I started with, the one thing that disappoints me the most, and I've seen a lot of churches and been around a lot of sound engineers, is, man, they just forget about the main thing, which is Jesus. We are here to glorify Jesus. We are here to worship Him, and we're here to be a part of His body, not to be this extra island, off behind the wooden island back here, and we are our own people. No, not at all. We are just as much a part of the body as the person sitting in the third row right there, and we're engaged and we're a part of it, and it's all for Jesus, and we cannot forget that. And so just continually reminding yourselves, and if you feel your heart getting hard, if you feel frustration setting in, take it to the Lord, ask Him why, talk to an elder, but get rid of that, because those things will only just grow and affect your mix ultimately, as you're mixing here at the church. So hope that's been helpful. Hope some of those pieces have been some things that you can kind of glean and have been helpful for you. So, all right. So questions, thoughts, comments, opposing viewpoints?